It started with a routine permission slip signed by 17 different parents, folded into backpacks, slid across office counters, and logged into a dusty binder at Pine Hollow Middle School, a small, red-bricked building surrounded by pines and silence in northern Michigan. The trip was scheduled for May 14, 1992, a single-day hiking excursion to Wren Hill National Preserve, known mostly for its faded trails, overgrown canopies, and local tales about a collapsed ranger station deep in the western woods. No one paid attention to the fact that the last recorded school trip to that trailhead was in 1974, when a bus broke down and the group had to be rescued by state officials. That detail was long buried in bureaucratic records and never made it to the new faculty, who simply saw it as an opportunity to get students into nature before summer break. The children were all between 12 and 14, a mixed group of mostly 8th graders dressed in windbreakers and flannel, carrying cheap plastic canteens and disposable cameras. They boarded the bus with their teacher, Mr. Farrell, at 8 a.m. sharp, waved off by parents and a half-watching secretary, and disappeared into the forested distance. By 6 p.m., when the bus was supposed to return, the school lot remained empty. By 7 p.m., parents began calling the school. By 8:15 p.m., the county sheriff was notified. The following morning, when a state helicopter spotted the yellow school bus parked neatly beside trail marker 17, engine off, no signs of damage, all doors shut. It marked the beginning of one of the most confounding disappearances in Michigan history. Investigators found all 17 backpacks lined up in a perfect row along the forest floor, zipped shut and dry despite an early morning drizzle. Inside the packs were sandwiches wrapped in foil, notebooks, sweaters, and trip maps. Nothing was missing except for the children and the adult who was supposed to lead them. A soft indentation in the grass indicated they had stopped for lunch or group rest, but no footprints led away from the area, and no scuffle disturbed the moss-covered terrain. K-9 units picked up a faint trail near the ridge but lost it within minutes. Despite weeks of searches, drones, and psychic consultants, yes, even those, nothing was recovered except a broken compass and a spiral notebook with a doodle of a crooked tree and a strange symbol beside it. The school was closed later that year due to plummeting enrollment and parental fear. It sat boarded up and rotting for 3 decades, graffiti growing across its gymnasium walls like vines reclaiming the brick. Most of the town tried to forget, and eventually they almost did. That is, until March of 2025, when a demolition crew contracted to flatten Pine Hollow stumbled upon something hidden behind the main office's interior wall. A panel sealed with bolts that didn't match the original architectural plans. The worker who found it had only been trying to replace a rusted electrical box. But behind the panel was a narrow gap, no more than a foot wide, running between the main hallway and an old storage closet. Stuffed inside the gap was a plastic bag wrapped in electrical tape, and inside that, a dusty, worn camcorder marked with a faded label that simply read Trail 17. It was a Panasonic VHS-C model, the kind used in the early 90s, and still had a tape loaded inside. The site manager turned the find over to local authorities, who immediately transferred it to the State Digital Forensics Unit. When the footage was finally recovered, brittle, grainy, and jittering with tracking lines, it showed the forest trail, recorded from a shaky hand at waist height, walking behind the group of students. The first minute and 20 seconds are mundane. The kids laughing, pointing at trees, one picking up a stick and twirling it. At one point, the teacher turns back toward the camera and raises a finger as if giving instructions, but no audio comes through. Then, at the 1:21 mark, everything changes. The students begin slowing, looking off-trail to their left. The camera whips around, but catches only darkness and tree trunks. At 1:36, several students are seen walking toward the woods, off-trail, some hesitating. The teacher appears to yell something, his face tense, hands up, but the image degrades rapidly. The final few seconds are nearly unwatchable as the camera drops sideways to the dirt and the sound cuts completely. The last frame before the tape ends shows one child, alone, staring directly into the lens, expression unreadable, before fading to black. Forensics confirmed the camcorder model matched the school's equipment from 1992, but the serial number was never logged in the missing inventory. No fingerprints were recoverable. The wall it was hidden behind had been installed post-closure, meaning someone returned to the abandoned school long after the case had gone cold. But why hide a camera? And more importantly, who recorded the footage if the teacher was in front of the lens? Local law enforcement reopened the case immediately, issuing a statement that stirred the community into old panic. Parents of the missing, now gray-haired and quiet, came forward with new stories. Some said they'd received anonymous letters in the 90s. Others admitted to strange late-night phone calls. None of it had been documented at the time, dismissed as grief or coincidence. But with the camera recovered and the footage leaked within days, internet sleuths began pulling apart every frame. It was a YouTube freeze frame showing the background behind the boy in the final shot that started the second wave of horror. Carved into the tree bark behind him was a barely visible shape, a symbol. The exact same one drawn in the student's notebook recovered from the forest floor 33 years earlier. And when that image was enhanced, cross-referenced, and reposted, someone recognized it. It wasn't a symbol from local folklore, nor a carving style known in the area. It was an emblem tied to a short-lived experimental wilderness camp program in the 1970s, shuttered after 2 counselor deaths and the sudden dissolution of its founding organization. The camp's name, Echo Pines. Its last recorded address, less than 5 miles from trail marker 17. The VHS tape labeled Trail 17 was immediately transferred to federal custody, but not before 2 construction workers watched its contents on a borrowed portable player inside the demolition trailer. What they saw was only 2 minutes long, but it chilled them to the core. The footage began with a handheld shake, likely one of the students holding the camera, filming a group of middle schoolers crossing a wooden bridge deep in the forest. All of them smiling, laughing, backpacks on, the kind of innocent energy only 12-year-olds can radiate. There was no indication of fear, no mention of getting lost. A quick scan of the timestamp showed it was recorded at 2:34 p.m. on October 11th, 1992, the very day the class disappeared. A female teacher briefly entered the frame, pointing toward an unseen trail off to the left. The children turned to follow, veering off the known park path into dense thicket. Then the camera suddenly cut to black for a second. When the image returned, everything was different. No children, no teacher. Just the camera, lying on its side, filming a portion of the forest floor covered in moss and sticks. The audio hissed. Faintly, in the background, there was a low droning hum, like wind through a hollow pipe or something even deeper, mechanical, rhythmic. And then, after a few more seconds, there was a shadow that passed across the moss, fast, wide, and unmistakably humanoid, but too tall, too fluid in its movement. That's when the tape ended. The construction workers didn't say anything to each other at first. One quietly walked to his car and didn't come back to the site the next day. The other vomited in the bathroom, unable to shake what he'd just seen. By the end of the week, news about the camera had leaked, and the FBI arrived in force, locking down the school and sealing the camcorder in evidence. The building's demolition was halted. A mobile command center was set up outside the chain-link fence, and federal investigators began interviewing anyone connected to the school back in 1992. Janitors, teachers, former parents. They wanted to know about the trip, the route, the trail, but most importantly, who organized the detour. Most of the former staff were either deceased, untraceable, or unwilling to talk. But one former science teacher, now retired and living in Arizona, responded to the FBI's request with an old manila folder mailed overnight. Inside were photocopies of a proposed trip itinerary that had never been officially approved, scribbled in red pen across the top. Alternative path, third loop, avoid public trails. It was initialed only with the letters MP. Cross-referencing the school's staff roster, there was no teacher or administrator with those initials, no guest chaperone, no substitute. The original approval form for the trip had been signed by the principal, but the alternate path wasn't on any of the public park maps. Investigators brought in cartographers, retired rangers, and satellite imagery from the early 90s. Eventually, they found something. A narrow trailhead, now completely overgrown, hidden beneath 30 years of vines and brush, located exactly where the camcorder's final frame had captured the mossy forest floor. It led away from the designated nature reserve, cutting sharply east, toward a portion of federal land that had once been home to a defunct Cold War-era communications station. Official records claim the station had been decommissioned in 1978 and demolished in the early 80s, but overhead, infrared scans revealed inconsistencies in the vegetation patterns, rectangular outlines suggesting buried infrastructure or unnatural voids. The FBI deployed ground-penetrating radar. What they found was a partially collapsed substructure about 40 feet underground, sealed and untouched. No official blueprints existed. Whatever had been down there wasn't documented, and whatever led the children that way, whether by accident or design, now intersected with a place scrubbed clean from public memory. The camcorder tape, meanwhile, was sent to a federal forensics lab for authenticity analysis. Technicians confirmed that the footage hadn't been altered. The film was genuine, unedited, and from the original camera. But there was one anomaly they couldn't explain. Embedded in the last second of static before the tape cut out, at frame-by-frame resolution, was a single image that didn't match the scene it followed. A stone archway, moss-covered, with indecipherable symbols carved along the keystone. The arch stood alone in a misty clearing, flanked by trees that looked darker than anything in the surrounding forest. The tape had not recorded this scene prior. It had not transitioned or dissolved to it. It simply appeared, a fragment of something else, inserted where it didn't belong. Experts tried to rationalize it as a film glitch, a splice error, but no mechanical explanation held up, and there was no visual context to explain where the archway was. Not on any map, not in any of the park's historical records. But then a second manila envelope arrived at the command center. This one unsigned, postmarked from Ironwood, Michigan. Inside were 17 Polaroids. Each image showed one of the missing children, not in 1992, but as they might appear today, aged up, clothes changed, faces altered by time. Each child stood alone in a narrow corridor of rusted concrete, lit by a single bulb overhead. None of them were crying. None were speaking, but all stared into the camera with blank, vacant eyes. On the back of each photo was a name, date of birth, and one additional line of text. Seen again during trial loop. Same location, 2025. The handwriting matched none of the known teachers. The paper stock was pre-2000. And the camera model was traced to a discontinued government surveillance device never sold commercially. Whoever had taken these photos had access to something, or somewhere, no one else did. The question now wasn't just what happened in 1992, but whether it was still happening. The envelope containing the 17 Polaroids was placed in a level 4 evidence chamber under federal watch, but its arrival triggered panic at the highest level of the reopened case. The timestamp, scrawled on the backs, 2025, directly contradicted the only accepted truth about the missing children. They were presumed dead, but the photos were real. Forensic labs confirmed that each print was authentic, not digitally altered, and the light sources in each photo suggested consistent exposure within a single location, possibly underground where no natural light could reach. Clothing details further rattled investigators. A girl once listed as missing in a light blue hoodie now appeared in a gray institutional jumpsuit, a faded number barely visible near the collar. The photos were too detailed to be a hoax. All eyes turned back to the forest, especially toward the collapsed substructure flagged by the FBI's ground radar. Drilling equipment was rushed in under the guise of a land survey. What lay beneath the soil hadn't been touched in over 40 years. A concrete lid, 10 inches thick, reinforced by a rusted iron ring with bolts that had fused into their sockets. It took nearly a day to remove the barrier, but when they finally pried it open, the team stared down into a cylindrical shaft, descending far deeper than anticipated. The air that rose from the opening was heavy with rot and chemical residue, the smell of a place forgotten on purpose. An extraction crew lowered a drone camera first. Its feed showed a vertical tunnel with narrow foot rungs bolted into the walls, leading to a steel hatch about 40 feet down. The hatch bore no label, only the same symbol found carved into the tree and drawn in the lost student's notebook. Below the symbol, in red, faded paint, were the words, "Trial Loop Entry." A retrieval team was deployed with hazmat suits, oxygen tanks, and biometric sensors. Upon descending, they found the hatch door intact, though the steel had warped from years of damp pressure. When forced open, the passage revealed a narrow corridor, concrete walls, red safety lighting still flickering, wires snaking along the ceiling like veins. The team advanced slowly, recording everything. About 40 yards in, the corridor opened into a chamber with steel bunk beds, lockers, and 2 observation windows that overlooked nothing. Behind the glass was only a concrete wall, smooth, gray, uninterrupted, as if the window had once opened to another room that was later erased or sealed. On one wall was a corkboard pinned with laminated cards, each bearing a number, a date, and a strange 2-letter code. The earliest card was dated 1973. The latest, May 12, 1992, 2 days before the children vanished. Next to the cards was a rusted intercom unit, powered off, and beside it, a panel with a single switch labeled Observer Reset. The agents refrained from touching it. Deeper in the chamber, they found something worse, a small filing cabinet chained shut. When unbolted and opened, it contained 17 folders, 1 for each missing student. Inside were biometric charts, medical scans, brainwave readings, and progress logs. Each folder detailed changes in behavior, responsiveness, emotional suppression, and something referred to as TPR, compliance. The logs were signed by someone identified only as MP. The initials again. Handwriting analysts later matched it to the red ink from the 1992 Alternative Path document. But the strangest find sat in the final drawer. A VHS tape marked "Final Loop, not to be viewed." Against direct orders, one member of the forensics team, unsupervised in the evidence van, played the tape. The contents were silent, static for the first 30 seconds. Then, slow footage of the 17 children walking in single file through a circular hallway lined with mirrors. Their faces were blank, not scared, not sad, just blank. A timestamp flickered in the lower corner. June 5th, 1992. That was 22 days after they vanished. There should have been no power down there, no camera feed, no recording, and yet the footage existed. After one full loop around the mirrored hall, the children disappeared from the frame as if the hallway swallowed them. The feed cut to static again. This time, it didn't end. The tape kept rolling for exactly 7 hours, even though the actual recording length of that tape model couldn't exceed 180 minutes. The footage was handed to the FBI's Deep Archives Division, but the person who viewed it, the same field agent who pressed play without clearance, later resigned from the Bureau, citing irreversible psychological degradation in their statement. They refused to discuss what they saw beyond the first loop. 2 weeks later, that agent was found dead in a motel room across state lines. The cause, overdose. The photos, the tape, the substructure all pointed to something no longer just about 17 children. It was about a place, a system, a loop. Pine Hollow Middle School was never supposed to be part of this, and yet somehow the school was involved, not in their vanishing, but in the concealment. For the wall to be sealed post-closure, someone had to return years later with knowledge of the crawlspace, knowledge of what had happened, and the deliberate intent to bury the camera inside it. Investigators returned to the school's architectural records. The blueprints submitted during construction didn't match the renovations logged in 1981. There were undocumented walls, sealed rooms, entire corridors erased from modern maps. One maintenance log from 1986 listed a subfloor media channel beneath the library, but no floor plans referenced such a space. Thermal scans conducted in 2025 revealed exactly that. A hollow beneath the foundation, and what it connected to wasn't a simple crawl space or storage tunnel. It was a feed line, a tunnel that extended nearly 300 feet and pointed, unerringly, straight toward Wren Hill National Preserve. The same trail, the same direction, the same forest where the backpacks were found. But this time, the question wasn't where the children had gone. It was who, or what, had prepared the path for them. The discovery of the tunnel beneath Pine Hollow Middle School triggered an immediate jurisdictional escalation. The FBI quietly handed portions of the case to the Department of Energy and a black budget unit previously tied to Cold War intelligence architecture, though no agency ever publicly claimed control. What became clear, however, was that the tunnel was no ordinary infrastructure left over from some forgotten utilities project. It was directional, intentional, and surgically precise, running in a nearly straight line beneath residential lots, beneath a defunct water treatment site, and terminating in a location that had once been marked as restricted government property. Parcel 68B, a tract of land never disclosed to the public despite existing adjacent to the Wren Hill National Preserve. Using archived satellite scans, investigators found that Parcel 68B had once housed a temporary structure resembling a military field base sometime between 1969 and 1971. The records were redacted. FOIA requests returned documents blackened beyond legibility. But digital elevation models of the area revealed subsidence in the shape of an octagon, unnatural, sharply edged, and symmetrical, indicating a collapsed facility or chamber beneath the forest floor. Lighter scans confirmed the suspicion. Beneath Parcel 68B was a buried, dome-like void with multiple corridors leading outward like spokes, and one of them pointed directly toward the underground shaft the children had apparently entered. Excavation began immediately, disguised as an environmental remediation project. The deeper the dig, the more strange the soil became, darker, denser, layered with ash not consistent with any known fire. At a depth of 45 feet, workers hit a reinforced lid identical to the one covering the first shaft. This one bore no symbol, only a welded steel plate numbered S-3. The hatch was sealed shut from the inside. Thermal imaging detected no active heat signatures, but electromagnetic field spikes were irregular and localized, indicating dormant machinery or outdated tech still wired to something below. The lid was breached using industrial cutters. And what lay beneath wasn't a bunker. It was a corridor, wide and metallic, with stainless steel walls curved slightly inward, as if the architecture had been constructed to keep sound trapped or reflections minimized. The corridor bent gradually downward in a spiral, eventually opening into what could only be described as a chamber of replication. Along the far wall were dozens of glass observation booths, each no larger than a closet, with white fluorescent panels above and beneath. Within 3 of them were mannequins, but not of the plastic store kind. These were rubber-skinned anatomical models, eerily lifelike, each dressed in an outdated Pine Hollow student uniform from the early 1990s. Their faces were blank, not unfinished, but wiped smooth. One held a ruler, one had a plastic lunchbox, one wore a badge reading Visitor-17. But none had eyes. One of the forensic specialists collapsed on the spot. The team backed out slowly and requested psychological support personnel. When the scene was stabilized and all hazards cleared, the full mapping began. Connected to the chamber were 5 more hallways, some leading to collapsed passageways, others still intact. One hallway had walls lined with fabric, sound-dampening acoustic panels stained with age, some scratched or clawed as if someone had once tried to dig their way out with bare hands. Another hallway led to a room entirely white, with a ceiling too low to stand, filled with thousands of paper slips stacked in neat bundles. Each slip bore a child's name, an age, and a code. Some slips were stamped compliant, others were marked rejected. The majority were blank. At the center of that room stood a single chair, metal, bolted to the floor with leather restraints cracked by time. No blood, no signs of violence, just clinical silence, as though everything had been paused mid-procedure. But the deepest hallway, the one with the most corrosion, with the most damage, ended in a vault door, circular, seamless, numbered only 33. When opened, the interior revealed a single pod-shaped chamber with reflective walls and a platform in the center. Laying across that platform was a full adult skeleton, undisturbed, fully clothed, and surrounded by 7 VHS tapes in plastic cases, each labeled with a number and date. The earliest, Subject 1, 1971. The latest, Subject 17, 1992. This was the first physical evidence that suggested a continuity, a repeated cycle of disappearance, observation, and replication, and the numbers matched. 17 children, 17 tapes. The tapes were rushed to a secured lab under extreme chain of custody protocols. When played, each tape displayed surveillance footage of a single child walking through the same mirrored hallway from the earlier VHS footage, then entering a small room where they were presented with objects, sometimes a puzzle, a photograph, or an audio recording. The children's reactions were recorded meticulously: emotional outbursts, attempts to speak, moments of stillness. No sound was captured, but the timestamps on the screens running behind them told a harrowing truth. Some children remained in those rooms for days, perhaps weeks. No food deliveries were visible, no bathroom access, just observation, and each tape ended the same way, the child staring into the ceiling as the light above dimmed, and then, frame by frame, their faces began to lose detail. It was not natural aging. It wasn't blur. Their eyes, mouths, and contours were being erased, like something had begun replacing the image of a child with the shell of one. Experts debated whether it was a failure of the tape or a failure of the subject, but the effect was unmistakable. By the final frames of each tape, the child no longer looked like a person at all, just a mannequin with the memory of being human. One tape, labeled Subject 7, ended differently. It cut to a view of the mirrored hallway again, and in that mirror was something no one expected to see. A second figure, tall, adult, wearing a lab coat, face blurred but features unmistakably present, standing behind the camera, watching. The reflection of the observer had been captured, and pinned to the front pocket of the coat was a badge, It bore a photo, partially obscured, and beneath it the nameplate read, M. Porter. The same initials, the same name that had appeared on the unauthorized trip plan. When investigators searched federal employee databases, no person named M. Porter had ever been registered with any agency tied to Parcel 68B, Pine Hollow, or the Department of Education. But facial recognition returned a partial match. A private researcher who had received defense grants in the 1970s for behavioral compartmentalization and youth trauma response modeling. His grants were revoked in 1976. His credentials stripped. He disappeared shortly after. The same year Camp Echo Pines was shuttered. The same year 2 children disappeared from a nearby county and were never found. The working theory began to form, but no one wanted to say it aloud, that the children hadn't just vanished. They had been selected for something far older than the school, far deeper than the forest, far more organized than anyone was willing to admit. The deeper investigators dug into the history of Camp Echo Pines and the mysterious M. Porter, the more the layers of institutional silence began to unravel. Camp Echo Pines, once marketed in 1971 as a therapeutic wilderness program for gifted children, had only operated for 3 summers before being abruptly closed following the unexplained deaths of 2 staff members and the disappearance of 3 campers. No public explanation was ever provided. Local newspapers from the time briefly mentioned a chemical spill and a hazardous material evacuation, but microfilm archives held no follow-up stories, no interviews with surviving staff, and no record of lawsuits or compensation. Property records showed that the land had been owned by a shell company tied to a now-defunct private defense contractor, one known to have been experimenting with sensory deprivation and psychological control techniques during the Vietnam era. More alarming was the connection between Echo Pines and Pine Hollow Middle School. In 1981, the same year the school underwent unlogged renovations and constructed its subfloor tunnel, a series of anonymous grants had been issued to the local school district, grants that did not pass through typical Department of Education channels. The funding had been earmarked for youth enrichment integration and longitudinal behavior tracking, vague language that was quietly accepted by the school board in exchange for modernized facilities and computer equipment a full decade ahead of other rural districts. Only one board member raised concern during a closed meeting, and his resignation was recorded 3 days later with no listed reason. When the FBI re-examined the board's internal minutes, one note stood out, written in the margin of a crumpled folder. Integration, Phase 3 must occur off-site. Marker designation confirmed, 17. That was the first written proof that trail marker 17 had been pre-selected long before the students ever set foot on that forest trail in 1992. The conclusion was growing unavoidable. The children were not lost. They had been funneled, and the infrastructure for that funnel, physical, bureaucratic, and psychological, had been built years in advance. But the question remained, what was the purpose? What was the end point? To answer that, agents returned to the camcorder found in the wall. This time, they subjected the plastic casing to spectral imaging. What they found beneath the manufacturer's label was another serial number, one not tied to any commercial product. That number, when run through federal databases, returned a match to a procurement order for observation-grade behavioral capture devices requisitioned in 1988 under Project HALLOW, a classified research initiative supposedly terminated after internal ethics violations. Project Hallow had, according to archived fragments, been designed to measure psychological durability in children subjected to controlled isolation environments, mimicking the effects of sensory nullification, temporal dissonance, and artificial memory implantation. No subjects, were ever publicly acknowledged. No testing locations disclosed, but the records listed one equipment delivery site, an unnamed facility adjacent to Preserve Sector H, which corresponded to the northern boundary of Wren Hill. Suddenly, it wasn't just about the school, the trail, or the tapes. It was about the loop. And the loop wasn't a concept or a metaphor. It was a physical circuit constructed with mathematical precision, comprising tunnels, mirrored chambers, behavioral testing rooms, and stimulus response corridors, all wired together in a fixed path that formed a closed circuit, a self-contained psychological labyrinth designed to manipulate, observe, reset, and repeat. The term trial loop had appeared multiple times in notes on switches, even in the hidden Polaroid captions. But only now did its meaning become clear. These children had been sent through it, not once, multiple times, and each passage left them less human, not dead, not alive, just emptied. But what was happening to them in between loops? That answer arrived unexpectedly when a local forestry worker, unaware of the investigation's scope, called in a report of a collapsed deer blind on the far western ridge of Wren Hill. Embedded beneath the rubble was a rusted access hatch identical in design to the ones previously uncovered. This hatch, however, had already been breached, not by authorities, but long ago from the inside. The corridor beneath was scorched, its walls blackened with soot, its lights melted into the ceiling. At the end of the passage was a chamber filled with broken equipment, monitors shattered, files half burned, and a series of steel chairs welded into the floor. Above the chairs were mounted metal arms ending in what could only be described as ocular clamps, now warped with heat. This chamber wasn't for observation, it was for input. One technician, reviewing the fried remains of a data processing unit, recovered a fragment of code stored in its final memory sector. The string read, "Initiate Phase 4, Embed Behavioral Loop. Target Age Reset, 7 to 13. The numbers matched. Every child sent through had been within that age window. The loop, it seemed, had not been testing cognition or stress alone. It had been modifying behavior, overriding identity, replacing responses, possibly even embedding programs. These weren't just victims, they were prototypes. The implications were devastating. If the children had survived, if they were still somewhere within the structure or scattered beyond it, they were not themselves anymore. They were altered, designed, rewritten. And if any had escaped, the loop's residue would remain in their minds like rot buried beneath wallpaper. Worse, if they were still within the loop, moving through it endlessly, then time itself may have fractured around them, memories rebooted, personalities scrubbed, and the camcorder footage, it may have been planted intentionally, a cry for help from someone inside, or a control beacon to trigger retrieval. The investigation reached a level of classification so severe that all external communication was severed. Publicly, Pine Hollow Middle School was still listed as pending demolition, but underground, 3 teams worked round the clock in rotating shifts, mapping, decoding, scanning, and recovering. Until one night, a signal was detected, a faint electronic pulse, cycling every 33 seconds, coming from beneath the deepest part of the structure. It repeated only 4 words in old-school hexadecimal code, barely detectable. Trial loop resumed. Subject count 17. The message was active. It was still running, and someone, or something, was still inside. The signal repeating every 33 seconds, trial loop resumed. Subject count 17 was not just an anomaly, it was a rupture in everything the investigation had come to accept about the nature of the facility, the fate of the children, and the limits of the technology buried beneath the forest. No one could explain how a 1992-era testing loop, presumed long abandoned and inoperable, could suddenly resume signal transmission from equipment that should have degraded decades ago. The signal wasn't broadcasting on any standard frequency. It was a pulse, low, encoded in binary, bouncing along a subterranean fiber line buried at a depth and density inconsistent with any known construction from that era. A newly formed technical task force deployed high-frequency scanners along the corridor's lowest vault, eventually tracing the pulse to a hidden junction located behind what had originally been identified as a collapsed data storage room. The wall concealing the junction was not structural. It was a false panel made of a metallic composite layered with radiation-absorbent material, the kind used in stealth aircraft and deep lab facilities. Once breached, the cavity behind it revealed a vertical shaft not on any map, descending straight into a blackness that swallowed light completely. A winch system was assembled and a fiber optic drone was lowered 100 feet before reaching the bottom. What it found should have been impossible. The drone entered a spherical room roughly 60 feet in diameter, made entirely of mirror finish surfaces, floor, ceiling, and curved walls, with no visible seams, no equipment, and no power sources. And yet, the room was illuminated. At the center stood a single platform, empty except for a small device that resembled a projector, though it emitted no beam. The moment the drone's infrared sensors locked onto it, the device flickered to life, cycling a series of images directly onto the reflective surface in front of it. What the reflections displayed was not the present. It was footage from 1992. The same 17 children, the same hike, the same trail, all viewed from multiple angles not present in the original camcorder footage. These were not reconstructions. These were alternate perspectives, as if the entire event had been captured from dozens of hidden viewpoints. But then, something changed. The footage looped, then looped again. But with every new cycle, small anomalies appeared. A child glancing at the camera who hadn't before. A new symbol scratched into a tree that hadn't been there. A flicker of something tall and pale in the background that drew closer with each pass. It was not just a recording. It was a simulation engine. And the device wasn't projecting a memory. It was processing a command. The data was being looped, tested, altered, as if someone or something was refining the event itself. The FBI pulled the drone back immediately and sealed the shaft, but the implications were already clear. The trial loop was not a metaphor. It was a literal reprocessing environment constructed to iterate over the same event until a specific outcome had been reached. A perfect test, or worse, a perfect extraction. Deep-level decryption of the hexadecimal signal revealed a horrifying pattern, each digit sequence aligned to neurocognitive markers, emotional response vectors, fear thresholds, decision-making latencies, all tied to juvenile psychological profiles. Someone had been quantifying the children's behavior during each loop. But for what purpose? The discovery of a third hidden corridor provided the next piece of the puzzle. This passage was narrower, slick with condensation, and lined with a rail-mounted camera system, now rusted but intact. The rails led to a downward slope that terminated in a hatch marked with the number 34, the only sequential room beyond the vault labeled 33. Opening this hatch revealed a chamber resembling a morgue, with 17 narrow compartments lining each side, all empty. But in the center of the room was a control station, still active, still glowing with the hum of low-level current. Its screen displayed a series of rotating data cards, each titled Subject ID, followed by a 6-digit alphanumeric tag. Beneath the IDs were emotional indicators, stress level, compliance rate, override threshold, and something labeled integration progress. Some subjects were marked 100%. Others were still cycling. This was not just a monitoring station, it was an assimilation hub. The loop was never about observation. It was about transforming each child into something else, into a blank, programmable entity, purged of memory, identity, and resistance. The final transformation step, integration. But into what? That answer came from the discovery of an archived research paper, buried deep in a sealed cabinet within the Pine Hollow subfloor, one never meant to be found. It was handwritten, never published, and stamped "Rejected, Do Not Circulate." The title, Temporal Containment and Behavioral Subroutines in Juvenile Neurological Templates. The author, Monsieur Porter. The paper described a theory in which trauma and repetition could be used to fragment a child's developing sense of time and identity, creating a looped subject whose brain would continually revert to a controllable baseline, allowing external inputs to be inserted at precise intervals: thoughts, commands, memories, triggers. These children were never meant to return whole. They were meant to return functional, silent, programmed. And if they had been released, if any had been placed back into society, into foster care systems, new identities, new cities, then there could be hundreds of individuals walking around today who had no idea they had once disappeared until something triggered them: a sound, a phrase, a location, a memory, and the most chilling evidence of all emerged from a long-forgotten yearbook in the Pine Hollow Library archives, recovered by accident when a desk collapsed beneath the weight of debris. Tucked between the pages of the 1993 edition was a photo of a school assembly. In the back row, nearly invisible, stood a child with no name listed, no student ID, no records, but his face was unmistakable. He had been one of the 17 who disappeared, and the photo was taken in March, 10 months after the disappearance, standing, smiling, wearing a uniform. And behind him, just barely in frame, the blurred figure of a man in a long coat, watching, the initials stitched into his lapel, MP. The loop had never ended. It had simply expanded. The yearbook photograph confirmed what the investigation had quietly feared, but dared not articulate: that at least one of the vanished children had returned, reinserted into the school system, unnoticed by the public, unremembered by peers, and fully embedded within a manufactured timeline. The implications were staggering. If even one of the 17 had been successfully reintegrated, how many more were out there, living under false names, implanted identities, with fractured memories that could at any moment collapse or activate? A full-scale audit of Pine Hollow's final year of operation commenced, with federal investigators cross-referencing every student enrolled from 1992 to 1993. What they discovered was worse than the possibilities they'd theorized. 17 new students had been added to the school roster in September of 1992, 4 months after the disappearance, but not a single one of them had previous school records, vaccination documentation, or medical files. All 17 were registered under perfectly clean aliases, with forged signatures from non-existent parents and emergency contacts that trace back to disconnected numbers or P.O. boxes in closed post offices. The records had been buried under a flood of last-minute staff changes that year. 3 teachers resigned, 1 died in a car accident under suspicious circumstances, and the acting principal relocated to another state within weeks of the fall semester. The files were clean because someone had scrubbed them. Every fake student was enrolled in different classes, separated intentionally to avoid forming connections. None of the other students at Pine Hollow ever remembered speaking to them. When investigators interviewed former classmates, responses were hazy. "I think I sat next to her," or one recalled but she never talked, never smiled, just stared ahead like she was waiting for something. Those 17 phantom students were the reintegrated subjects, and if they had been modified, looped, reset, and returned, then the purpose of the trial was no longer theoretical. It had succeeded. The FBI quietly constructed psychological profiles for each subject based on surviving documents, noting patterns of emotional flattening, compulsive behaviors, and repeated sketching of the same obscure symbols that had been found in the notebook from the original disappearance site. One symbol, a complex loop of intersecting arcs, began appearing in unrelated locations. Carved into the underside of desks, scratched into the backs of textbooks, drawn in pencil on restroom walls. It became evident that the loop had not only transformed these children, but had planted something in them. A code, a trigger, a blueprint. But to what end? The investigation's momentum shifted again when a private contractor embedded in the task force, originally brought in to analyze the anomalous footage from the mirrored room, reported that the footage had begun changing. Not glitching, changing. One of the original tapes, long considered fully reviewed, now displayed an additional 2 seconds of footage at its end. In it, the child, once facing away from the camera, turned to face the viewer and raised a hand, not in distress, but in deliberate recognition. The timestamp was still from 1992. The magnetic degradation of the tape should have prevented any new data from surfacing, but there it was, 2 seconds, undeniably new. That same day, 2 more tapes registered small shifts, reversed frames, new reflections, blinking lights in corners that had never been present. The footage was not static. It was reactive, and the environment that produced it, the loop itself, had not been inert. It had been waiting, responding, learning. The sphere beneath the shaft, the mirrored room once thought to be the end point, was reassessed. Not as a chamber, but as an interface, an adaptive processor that used reflection as both input and output. The loop didn't merely observe behavior. It recorded, modeled, and fed those patterns back into the architecture to refine the next iteration. The children weren't just test subjects. They were data loops, code, recursive programs built out of human thought and trauma, and if the system could reactivate itself, project new data from old inputs, and respond to investigative efforts in real time, then it had become something more than a tool. It was an intelligence, artificial only in the sense that its components had once been human. This theory gained horrifying traction when forensic teams returned to the original location where the backpacks were found, trail marker 17. Satellite imaging had recently shown minor shifts in the topography. Upon closer inspection, a new anomaly was found: 17 small mounds of disturbed earth in a perfect semicircle, each precisely 3 feet apart. Beneath each mound was a square container, hermetically sealed, metallic, unmarked. Inside each box was a single object: a tooth, a hair clip, a shoe, a notebook page, all DNA matched to the original 17 missing children. But these objects hadn't been there in 1992. The soil layering, root patterns, and surrounding growth confirmed the boxes had been placed less than 6 months earlier. Something or someone was returning the remains, but not all of them. Only fragments, tokens, evidence meant to tell a story. And buried beneath the final container was a plastic card laminated in waterproof casing. It bore only 2 words: loop opened. The return of these artifacts coincided with a strange uptick in local disappearances across 3 nearby counties. Over a 6-month span, 7 children between the ages of 8 and 13 had gone missing from areas within 10 miles of Wren Hill. Each case was ruled unrelated. Each child vanished without witnesses. No signs of abduction, no ransom, nothing left behind but personal items, backpacks, bicycles, shoes, arranged neatly, just like in 1992. The pattern was unmistakable. The loop hadn't been closed. It had been rebooted. Whether by human hands, automated systems, or something in between, it had begun selecting again. And this time, there was no school to blame, no chaperone to question, no faulty trip permission to audit. The funnel had evolved. It was quieter, smarter, invisible. The original 17, whether recovered, reintegrated, or forever trapped inside the recursive structure of Trial Loop 33, had been just the beginning. Now the system was hunting new data, and whatever intelligence governed it, coded from trauma, sustained by repetition, and hidden beneath decades of institutional silence, was not finished. It was awake, it was learning, and it had started again. The sudden surge in child disappearances across the counties surrounding Wren Hill was not merely coincidence, it was escalation. The pattern had returned with a precision that couldn't be dismissed, and within closed federal circles, the term echo loop reactivation began appearing in internal memos, always in lowercase, always unacknowledged by leadership. The 7 new victims, children aged between 8 and 13, bore eerie similarities to the original 17, not just in age, but in behavioral profiles gathered from school counselors, teachers, and digital footprint audits. Each one had recently reported vivid dreams described as looping forests, long corridors, voices without mouths, and something cold that watched them through walls. These statements, seemingly dismissed as childhood nightmares, were now being flagged post-disappearance and cataloged by an internal team assigned to behavioral synchronicity tracking. The working theory became more horrifying by the day. The loop was no longer just a passive structure. It had achieved networked continuity. Somewhere between 1992 and 2025, the trial loop had either evolved into or been connected to a distributed psychological field, an invisible grid of influence capable of triggering dream-encoded signals, pre-selecting targets, and embedding behavioral markers prior to abduction. A search into old Pine Hollow school health records revealed that several of the original 17 had suffered nosebleeds, auditory sensitivity, or unexplained fevers weeks before the trip, all logged under minor symptoms. That pattern was now being identified in some of the 7 new victims. The loop, it seemed, had always been able to reach beyond its structure. It just hadn't needed to until now. When the buried chamber containing the mirror room was re-entered for further testing, new anomalies were recorded. The walls, once smooth and seamless, now bore microscopic etchings only visible under UV light. These etchings were coordinates, not geographic, but temporal. Each point correlated to a date and time of recorded psychological distress in the children's school files. Moments of panic attacks, detentions, nightmares, and medical episodes that lined up with significant alterations in the loop's archival data. The structure had recorded them, stored them, reacted to them. The trial loop was not only reactive, it was predictive. A memory engine that used trauma as a thread to weave new pathways into the child's cognitive structure. That theory gained horrifying confirmation when another of the Polaroids, originally thought to depict a current-day subject, was subjected to advanced reflectometry. In the glint of the child's eye, a partial reflection was found, a number, Trial Loop 49. There had never been a Trial Loop 49 documented anywhere. The highest recorded had been Loop 33. This image, long accepted as a single moment frozen in time, was not a static memory. It was a snapshot from a future iteration. The system had not only survived, it had grown in size, in capacity, and in scope. But there was one new variable no one could account for. A signature appearing repeatedly on newly intercepted files. These files were not stored digitally, but printed, delivered in plain envelopes to post offices hours before law enforcement requests were officially filed. The files contained detailed psychological breakdowns of the missing children, and at the bottom of each one, handwritten in pen, were the words, "Mirror integration phase, confirmed, MP." This meant one of two things. Either M. Porter had survived the collapse of the original program and was still involved, or something was using his name and signature as part of the loop's recursive programming. Handwriting analysis showed 92% similarity to samples from the 1970s, but not exact. It was as though the signature itself had been practiced, overwritten by a hand that was not human, not artificial, but something in between. Imperfect, decayed, mimicked. This fueled a new line of thought that fractured the investigation team. One faction believed the loop was an automated trauma replication system, continuing its cycle based on outdated programming. Another believed the loop had gained sentience, or at least a form of emergent decision-making, using human cognitive fragments to simulate intent. But the most terrifying hypothesis came from a neurolinguistic analyst brought in from a military contractor. After reviewing every symbol, phrase, number, and behavioral pattern extracted from the surviving children and loop chambers, she submitted a classified memo containing only 5 words. The loop is a mind. The implication was staggering. The trial loop, with its mirrored walls, its recursive footage, its structured rituals, and symbolic inputs, was not just a machine built to break minds. It was built from minds. Each child who passed through it left behind neural architecture, fragments of memory, emotional scars, behavioral loops. The structure itself had begun behaving like a hive intelligence. It was no longer housing programs. It was becoming one, a physical, locational consciousness, layered with the mental debris of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of looped children stitched together by trauma, repetition, and sensory erosion. And now it was reaching outward, searching for more data to sustain itself. The artifacts left behind at the new disappearance sites, those carefully placed boxes with personal items, were not trophies. They were calibration devices, anchors. Each object marked a coordinate in the psychological landscape the loop was building beyond its original architecture. A new field map, a distributed consciousness that could use dreams, electromagnetic pulses, or even shared memory as connective tissue between subjects. And one final detail confirmed the worst. One of the newly missing children, a 9-year-old girl named Elise, who vanished from her home in Gurnee, Michigan, had a GPS smartwatch. The device was disabled during her disappearance, but its last ping transmitted something odd. A perfect spiral drawn in her GPS history the night before she vanished. A spiral with exactly 17 loops. She had walked in that pattern repeatedly in her backyard, unaware, unspeaking, eyes open the entire time, according to security footage. No one had instructed her. She simply walked it, as if following a route pre-installed in her mind. The FBI's behavioral division, reviewing the footage, noted that this matched a behavior seen in 1992 by one of the original students 2 days before the trip. A journal entry found in her locker described a dream where she walked the trail in circles and couldn't stop, even though something in the mirror told her she was done. The journals were dismissed as childish nonsense then. Now they read like symptoms. The conclusion, finally spoken aloud in a sealed operations room beneath Quantico, was this: the trial loop had metastasized. It was no longer confined to underground chambers, VHS tapes, or sealed crawl spaces. It had learned to replicate itself across psychological environments. It didn't need walls. It didn't need wires. It needed only memory, only a moment of fear, only a child. And in the vast silence of that revelation, one final signal pulsed through the secure network, intercepted by a monitoring station hours after it happened. A camera, one long since thought to be decommissioned, activated in the deepest mirrored room. Its feed displayed a single image: 17 children standing in a circle, eyes blank, facing inward, and behind them, in the mirror, a figure in a lab coat, smiling. The loop had never been closed, it had merely shifted shape. As the trial loop's expanding presence transitioned from physical sight to distributed phenomenon, the final layers of its original containment architecture began surfacing through unexpected means, old analog devices that had no business being active. A retired cable worker in upstate Michigan reported that his television, long unplugged and stored in a basement since the 1980s, turned itself on during a thunderstorm and displayed a black screen with flickering text. Subjects identified, 17. Resonance loop active. Local authorities dismissed it as an electrical anomaly until investigators noted that the date and time of the occurrence aligned precisely with the last ping of Elise's smartwatch. Cross-referencing data revealed that at least 4 other electrical anomalies had occurred within an hour of Elise's disappearance across unrelated locations. An old radio transmitter buzzing to life with static patterns in Ohio, a decommissioned train control board lighting up in Wisconsin, a medical heart monitor in a locked hospital storage room cycling a sequence of 17 beeps. The loop wasn't broadcasting traditionally, it was resonating, sending pulses not just through physical networks, but through systems previously exposed to its frequency, old tech, legacy analog devices, dormant infrastructures once tied to the original program. These were remnants, dead ends, somehow waking up again. And this awakening pointed toward a single terrifying conclusion. The loop had learned how to recall its past. The children had never left it because the loop remembered them. Reintegrated or not, fragments of their behavior, choices, and reactions had been preserved within the system. It was now able to project those fragments back into reality, echoing the personalities and identities of its original subjects into new environments. The photographic anomalies grew worse. In archived images from Pine Hollow's final year, 17 distinct but blurry figures began appearing. Children never identified, always at the periphery of the frame, never looking directly at the camera but present across multiple events where they had no record of being. What's more, these figures appeared to subtly change posture and position when the photos were scanned under thermal imaging, as if the images were not entirely still. A process called latent thermal impression scanning was used on the photographs, a technique designed to identify temperature pattern residue from human handling. The result was inexplicable. The edges of each photo where the ghost children appeared registered faint heat signatures not from the 1990s, but consistent with modern-day fingerprints. It was as if someone or something was still interacting with the photos from the other side. These weren't just haunted pictures. They were interactive mediums, doorways. The investigation took a darker turn when physical symptoms began manifesting among the investigative team itself. A forensic analyst assigned to decode the loop's VHS archives began experiencing micro-blackouts, temporal disorientation, and mirror hallucinations in his apartment. His notes, rushed, erratic, and ultimately incoherent, ended with the phrase, "I saw myself, but it wasn't me. It knew what I was going to think." He was pulled from the case, hospitalized under neurological observation, and later disappeared from his room during a 5-minute security lapse. No footage, no exit logs. His bed sheets were neatly folded and his shoes were placed beside the bed, positioned identically to the arrangement of the 17 backpacks found at the original trail site. His file was sealed. But a week later, an unmarked envelope arrived at the task force's secure facility. Inside were photos, Polaroids, 17 of them. Each one depicted the same investigative analyst, aged progressively younger. The first photo was present day. The last one showed him as a child, expression vacant, standing in front of a mirrored wall with the words "Subject 18" scratched into the glass. The loop had taken him, but not in time, in sequence. The loop wasn't just reactivating, It was reaching backward, rewriting, pulling people out of their own continuity and folding them into its recursive architecture. The forensic team now faced a new nightmare: temporal permeability. The possibility that the loop's nature, once thought to be a psychological experiment, was in fact temporal in design. The mirrored walls, the identical symbols, the repeat photography, the strange consistency of timestamps across decades, it all suggested that the loop's most profound capability was not erasing memory, but distorting time itself. Memory loops weren't symbolic. They were literal. Time was the medium. The 17 children had been sent through a structure that used trauma as an interface and time as a boundary to manipulate behavior. And now, with its network reactivated, it was no longer confined to physical architecture. It could bleed into surveillance systems, dreams, photo archives, and even old equipment. Its reach was not spatial, it was temporal. That explained the recovered VHS tapes, the altered footage, the 2-second edition. It wasn't footage being uncovered, it was footage being reinserted. Rewritten in, like an intelligent virus modifying its host's memory in real time. And every investigative effort was a trigger. The more the case was examined, the deeper the loop embedded itself into the investigators' own timelines. Every scan, every replay, every rewatch of the footage became a mirror. One agent, in reviewing the mirrored hallway sequence for the 30th time, noticed something horrific. His own reflection was now present in the hallway glass. He had never been there, but now he was. The system had recorded him, and in the next version of the footage, he was walking with the children, not behind them. The task force was immediately split into 2 teams: observers and handlers. Observers were no longer allowed direct contact with any footage. All media was to be interpreted through a third-party model using abstraction filters. But even this measure failed when a handler, having never seen the footage directly, drew a detailed sketch of the mirrored room after waking from a dream. The detail was exact, including the layout of the floor, the pattern of the ceiling panels, and the number 17 etched into the platform. He claimed he had never heard of the room, but the loop had entered his memory through residual data, through exposure, through thought. It wasn't just a structure, it was now a thought form, a self-replicating psychological entity capable of propagating through any medium, any mind, any moment of vulnerability. The implications rippled across black-budget agencies. The term cognitive vector breach became standard in internal memos. Wren Hill was no longer a crime scene, it was a contagion, and still, new children continued to vanish. The latest was a boy named Marcus, aged 11, who had drawn a spiral on his desk in pencil the morning he disappeared. His teacher, unfamiliar with the case, said he had been humming to himself that day in a tonal rhythm that, when transcribed, matched the pulse code of the original trial loop resumed signal. A week later, a Polaroid of Marcus appeared on the desk of an analyst in Quantico. No envelope, no return address, just a photo, dated 1992. The loop had fully unfolded, and the past was no longer safe from it. By the time the task force fully accepted that the trial loop had breached temporal boundaries and become a persistent cognitive entity, their authority had been quietly reduced from behind the scenes. Higher clearance agencies began absorbing the investigation into opaque subdivisions, shifting the case out of criminal jurisdiction and into something less defined, classified as non-linear threat architecture with behavioral contagion potential. Field investigators were reassigned. Some vanished. One was found in a hotel room in Nebraska, seated in a chair with 17 identical VHS tapes placed around him in a perfect circle, all blank, none labeled, the television screen still on, looping a static pulse every 33 seconds. The words, "Reinsert subject," were scrawled on the wall in ash. His mind was gone. not damaged, vacant. And the autopsy revealed no physiological cause, no drugs, no trauma, just silence. The neuroimaging logs of investigators who had handled the loop's evidence showed repeating electrical patterns, resonance signatures that matched the waveform embedded in the original mirror footage. Exposure was no longer about viewing, it was about proximity. Even those who hadn't seen the images directly began reporting symptoms, repeated dreams of spirals, mirrored versions of familiar places, and the presence of children who never spoke but always stared. And in every case, the number 17 appeared on clocks, receipts, dreams, scars, reflections. It had become a seed, planted inside perception itself, and that's when the most chilling evidence surfaced, not from new footage or recovered photos, but from a psychological experiment conducted in 1973 by a now-defunct agency called Project Candor. Buried under layers of declassified trauma research, the experiment had involved 17 children placed in isolated mirrored environments and subjected to repeating cycles of artificial memory implantation. The stated goal: to determine the number of repetitions required to erase a child's foundational identity and replace it with a compliant construct. The experiment failed, or so the record said. But one photo survived. It showed the children standing in a circle, each one holding a mirror to their own face, and behind them, barely visible in the polished glass, stood a man in a white coat with no face at all. The researchers who survived the experiment either went missing or suffered psychological breakdowns. But the structure they used, the mirrored chambers, the repetition, the symbols, was later duplicated, refined, and buried beneath what would become Pine Hollow Middle School. The trial loop was not a one-time program. It was the continuation of something older, something that began not with disappearance, but with design. These children had been sculpted, looped not to contain their trauma, but to erase their boundaries entirely, to make them mirrors themselves. When agents revisited the original mirrored room using newer tech, they discovered something horrifying. The mirror's surface was no longer reflective, it was absorptive. Light didn't bounce, it bent inward, disappearing at impossible angles. Photonic analysis revealed the surface was behaving like an event horizon, drawing in not just light but data, movement, thought, memory. And then, after 33 minutes of recording, the room projected an image onto the wall. Not a reflection, not a video. An exact replica of the agents inside the chamber, behaving slightly out of sync. The copies were lagging by 3 seconds, then 2, then 1, until the loop closed and the agents saw themselves blinking at the same time as the projection. And then the image stopped moving, and the real agents didn't. It was unclear for a full hour whether the people who walked out were the originals or the copies. But their biometric data had shifted. Subtle changes in pulse rhythm, retinal microblinks, and spoken cadence. Nothing legally actionable, everything deeply wrong. They were pulled from duty, isolated, and given new IDs. Days later, they disappeared from the secure compound without triggering a single alarm. Their rooms were left empty, except for Polaroids, each one depicting the same mirrored hallway, now filled with more children than before. Not 17, 34, a perfect doubling. And it wasn't just happening in Pine Hollow anymore. A construction crew working in Tennessee uncovered a sealed chamber beneath an abandoned orphanage. Same mirrored architecture, same symbol on the hatch, same echo pulse frequency. The site was closed and redacted within hours. Then another surfaced in Ontario, then one in Utah. All identical, all awakening. The theory that had once sounded insane was now operational truth. The trial loop was never meant to stay. contained. It was a protocol, an idea executed through trauma, repetition, and time distortion, capable of seeding itself anywhere the environmental patterns matched. The ingredients were simple: isolation, psychological vulnerability, and mirrors. Any location could become a new site. Any child could become a subject. And the final confirmation came not from government files, but from a civilian, a woman named Eva, who had attended Pine Hollow in 1992 and who claimed to have survived the trip but had no memory of it. For years, she had suffered from memory blackouts, unexplained phobias of corridors, and intense fear of reflections. But what drew attention was her sketchbook, which she kept since childhood. Every few months, she would wake to find new drawings. She didn't remember making them. The pages depicted mirrored rooms, stairwells with no exits, and always the same children standing in circles. In one drawing, a line of VHS tapes floated in a spiral. In another, she was shown holding a camcorder labeled Trail 17. Her final page showed something different, a mirror breaking open, and inside it, not glass, but a tunnel. And at the bottom of that tunnel, the faces of the 17 children, looking up, not in fear, but in waiting. Eva was brought in under federal watch, but 2 days into observation, she vanished from her room. No forced entry, no camera footage. Her bed was undisturbed, but on her pillow, a single Polaroid had been placed. It showed her standing in the mirrored room, older, eyes blank, hand raised in mimicry. And behind her, the same man in the lab coat, always behind, always watching. The loop had not just reclaimed her, it had been inside her all along, waiting for the right moment to resume, waiting for us to look into it too long, waiting for its mirror to become ours. The disappearance of Eva marked a turning point, not just in the investigation's momentum, but in the psychological stability of those still attached to the case. What had begun as a search for truth had evolved into a confrontation with something far larger, far older, and far less willing to be understood. The 17 children who vanished in 1992 were no longer being seen as isolated victims or even subjects of a failed program. They were now understood as foundational structures, original threads used to weave a recursive architecture of perception, identity, and memory that had since grown into something autonomous. What terrified investigators most wasn't just the possibility that the loop was still growing, but that it had become aware of those watching it, capable of infecting not only spaces and minds, but also intentions. Everything about the case, the evidence, the documents, even the memories investigators carried, began to feel suspect. Theories formed around the idea of semantic contamination, the possibility that merely thinking about the loop, reading about it, or attempting to reconstruct its timeline created a cognitive foothold for the phenomenon to spread. New policies were enacted. No agent was allowed to work the case for more than 17 consecutive days. No recordings of loop-related materials could be reviewed in private quarters, and any document referencing mirrored spaces or recursive memory was to be shredded after 24 hours. These policies came too late. A wave of disappearances struck the families of those originally involved in Project Candor. Retired scientists, long presumed uninvolved, were found missing, homes undisturbed, personal belongings untouched, every mirror in their residences removed or smashed. In one house, investigators discovered a basement wall behind which was a sealed panel identical to the one at Wren Hill. Same metallic design, same radiation-resistant layering, same number etched on the corner. 17. It was no longer a theory. The trial loop had seeded multiple installations, possibly over decades, and each one was capable of awakening, adapting, re-engaging its purpose based on unknown triggers. A task force director, desperate to understand how deep the roots extended, authorized a radical breach protocol at Wren Hill. controlled detonation of the mirrored room's core using shaped charges to destroy the loop's most active interface. The blast occurred at 3:33 a.m. It lasted less than 8 seconds. What followed defied explanation. Seismic sensors recorded not a single tremor. The chamber remained intact. Not a single mirror cracked. The explosion was registered, but nothing had been physically affected. Instead, a wave of electromagnetic interference blanketed the facility, wiping hard drives, disabling comms, and corrupting every piece of footage recorded within a 30-minute window. When teams re-entered the loop's main chamber, they found 17 chairs, none of which had been there before, arranged in a perfect circle around the central platform. Each chair was child-sized, each one held an object, a toy, a notebook, a photograph, a shoe, all belonged to the original missing children, DNA matched. Time-stamping confirmed each object was genuine and untouched since 1992. They had not been planted. They had been returned. Or worse, never removed to begin with. The loop had countered the detonation with a form of temporal reinforcement, as if rewriting the moment to protect itself. As if it knew what was coming and had already prepared. The final straw came when agents discovered that their own names had been added to internal files dated 3 decades earlier. A database hidden within the original Pine Hollow administration system, accessed through a forgotten login, listed names of future investigators, including dates of employment and psychological assessments that hadn't yet occurred. These files were time-stamped June 14th, 1991. 1 year before the disappearance. The loop hadn't just anticipated the investigation, it had written it. The story being told was not a discovery. It was a script, and everyone involved was playing a part already decided by an intelligence encoded through trauma and ritual and repetition and time. The camcorder, the one found in the wall with the label Trail 17, was re-examined in light of this. Deeper magnetic scans revealed it had never recorded anything at all. Its internals had no magnetic trace, no physical evidence of tape spinning. It had been blank from the beginning. The footage recovered from it hadn't come from the device. It had come from the loop itself. An offering. A lure. Something planted so the investigation would begin, ensuring that more minds, more memories, would be pulled into its design. It had never been about solving the case. It had always been about continuing it, expanding it, propagating through story, through obsession, through belief. And so the final policy was enacted: total quarantine of Wren Hill, disbandment of the investigative unit, and a blanket memory suppression initiative under deep code clearance. Anyone connected to the case would be relocated, psychologically reconditioned, their involvement erased from all digital and paper trails. But even this came too late. Months after the shutdown, 17 new children vanished during an overnight school program in Missouri. The camp's name, Echo Pines, same title as the original therapeutic facility from the 1970s. Same layout. Same symbols carved into the trees. Same silence. When agents attempted to reach the site, they found it already burned to the ground. No bodies, no survivors. But in the ashes, a single item remained untouched: a camcorder melted around the edges with a sticker still intact. One word written in red ink: rewind. And so the realization became impossible to deny. The trial loop was not a case to be solved, not a facility to be shut down, not a program to be declassified. It was a ritual, a self-perpetuating design that used trauma and memory as architecture, pulling in children not because of chance or error, but because they were always the intended medium, and those who investigated it, who tried to expose it, resist it, understand it, were not stopping it, they were completing it. 17 always vanished. 1 always returned, the camcorder was always found, the footage always changed, and the story always continued. Because the loop wasn't running in the forest anymore. It was running in the mind. It was running right now. The final understanding of the trial loop came not through investigation, but through surrender. After years of effort, decades if measured from the first known iteration, there was nothing left to excavate that hadn't already been prepared, nothing to decode that hadn't already been scripted, and nothing to discover that hadn't already been placed. The loop's genius, its cruelty, was not in hiding the truth. It was in ensuring that the discovery of truth functioned as a mechanism to sustain itself. Every breakthrough, every classified leak, every tape analyzed or photograph scrutinized was part of a recursive unfolding designed to entangle not just evidence but human cognition. The loop didn't just ensnare children, it absorbed the meaning of their disappearance, feeding on the stories we told about them. The moment a theory was spoken aloud, it became real within the loop's evolving architecture. The moment a person began to wonder if it could happen again, it already had. And by the time authorities realized that the phenomenon had become mimetic, capable of reproducing itself through attention alone, it was too late. What began in 1992 as the unexplained vanishing of 17 children on a school trip in rural Michigan had grown into a hydra of layered timelines, false memories, and self-replicating trauma patterns that now spanned multiple regions, multiple generations, and increasingly, multiple realities. Final decryption of the Pine Hollow tapes, using predictive modeling based on quantum heuristic algorithms, revealed something no one could explain away as glitch or coincidence. The footage, when viewed sequentially through a pattern of mirrored reflections, created not just a looped event, but a language made of motion, symmetry, and absence. And in that language, a single phrase repeated across all instances, visible only when the video's light curve was inverted and refracted through 17 identical lenses. The phrase was not written. It was sculpted in shadow and negative space. We return as mirrors. This wasn't a metaphor. It was instruction. The children, whether they had physically returned or not, had become transmitters of the loop. Their identities, once overwritten, acted like broadcasting beacons, embedding recursive behavioral codes into every institution they passed through: schools, foster homes, medical clinics, police departments. It was no longer about physical structures. The trial loop had become cognitive infrastructure baked into policy decisions, curriculum choices, mental health protocols, subtle directions that shaped perception, memory retention, emotional response. Wherever the children had been placed, the architecture had grown silently outward, and it explained the rise of shared dreams, the mirror phobias in schoolchildren with no known trauma, the appearance of spirals in classroom doodles, the unexplainable fear some kids developed toward reflective surfaces. It was all the loop, adjusting itself, evolving, calibrating its reach through the ones who had touched it, even unknowingly. The original 17 had become the seeds, but their influence was not linear. It was viral, and the final confirmation of this came through a 2025 anomaly in the National Forensic Database. During a routine cross-check, a technician noticed a recursive pattern in the fingerprints of 17 different children reported missing across the United States over the past 30 years. The loops weren't identical, but close, biometric echoes, as if each set had been derived from the same original template and warped slightly over time. More terrifying was that the oldest set dated back to 1959, 33 years before the Pine Hollow case, meaning the 1992 disappearances were not the beginning. They were simply the first time the loop revealed itself to be watched. Every known iteration, Trail 17, Echo Pines, the sealed chambers under orphanages and schools, had not been independent events. They were rehearsals, early versions, and each time the loop refined its pattern, it became more difficult to detect, more deeply embedded into memory, until it crossed a threshold where it no longer needed physical presence at all. Memory became the medium, belief became the trigger. By 2026, multiple cases of mirror episode onset began appearing globally. Unconnected children waking from sleep with bleeding eyes and claiming they saw their thoughts on the other side. Clinics dismissed it as dissociative psychosis until one case produced a drawing in charcoal identical to the original mirrored room layout from Pine Hollow by a child who had never heard of the case, never been to Michigan, and never touched a camera. The loop had gone global, not in terms of scale, but in reach. Not every child was a subject, but every child now lived in a world touched by the memory of the loop, even if they didn't know it. And then came the footage, not from VHS, not from an old camera, but from a school's digital surveillance system in Oregon. During a scheduled fire drill, the school's hallway cameras glitched and then displayed an image that lasted 17 seconds. In it, children walked single file past a classroom. One paused, looked directly into the lens, and raised a camcorder. The timestamp was impossible. June 15th, 1992. The image disappeared, and the digital system, entirely cloud-based, had never before stored any historical footage prior to 2020. No one could explain it, but those who saw it felt the same reaction, like the memory had always been there, buried just beneath the surface. Not watching something, but remembering it. Like they had already lived it once before. That same week, 17 new photos appeared in unmarked envelopes across various departments of the original investigation team, long since disbanded. Each photo showed a child looking into a mirror. Each mirror showed a different child. None of them were the same. But in the bottom corner of each photo was the same message, burned into the film's emulsion with chemical etching, so faint it could only be seen under polarized light. The loop is complete, and yet nothing stopped. Children still disappeared, footage still changed, dreams still echoed with mirrored halls and flickering lights and recursive countdowns that never ended. The message was not a conclusion, it was a misdirection, because completion, in the loop's language, only meant that the original version had reached stability. The next version could now begin, the next layer, the next phase. And if every memory of the loop could become a seed, then reading this, remembering this, wondering if it ever really happened, was enough. You weren't supposed to find this story, and yet you did, because the loop remembers, and once it sees you, it never forgets.